Thanks, Joe. If you'd been listening even a little bit to the music intro, unfortunately, I didn't have it cued in for the first. I had Aretha Franklin singing "Amazing Grace" and ended up with Bocelli, and then some interesting instrumental versions of "Amazing Grace." This will be our last, formal vocabulary of soul session. And I want to talk about grace today. And um, the song itself, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. John Newton, who was a 19th century, well, barely, most late 18th century sea captain who was actually transporting slaves to the Americas, just met a form of God that he didn't understand, but it saved his bacon during a huge storm. And that's where the song came from. And then he spent the rest of his life trying to end the slave trade in Britain and eventually influenced that. That's where the song came from. Uh, so we're going to talk about grace in all its forms. Um, it's personal to me because, years ago, I guess maybe 25 years ago, when I left teaching in the classroom, 30 years in the classroom, uh, I was just sitting right here. I was sitting on a cushion, not on this chair, and there's nothing here. We moved everything next door, and I had an empty place. It's hard to believe now. Nothing was on the walls or anything, and I didn't know what I was going to do. Gave up my day job, and I knew I wanted to continue teaching, uh, but now I was going to shift to adults. But I didn't really have. I had some ideas, but it was really sort of like terror and bliss of graduating from being a classroom teacher, but terror of not really knowing the next, barely the next step. So as I was sitting here, it just came to me that I was going to create a space for grace. I didn't quite know what that meant, but it just came to me in the sitting. So, and that's really held for all these years. So, and the amount of grace that has come through to keep this going. Look at Heart to Heart. Jill and I she pushed me into doing this to walk the plank, more or less, to do it, even though I didn't want to do it. And now here we are. Got through the storm of the pandemic, and we're still going because it was just it's turned into something that um, is filled with grace. So anyway, this means a lot to me to talk about grace. Here's a quote from Simone Weil. She was, if you don't know her, she was like between the world wars, a Jewish woman, then became an atheist, then became a Catholic. She talk about a journey, working in factories where she working with the common people. She was a socialist, communist, as well as all those other things. But eventually caused her to die young because she just got weak and experience in the life of the people working in the factories. But she said, we must not, this is really a great quote, we must not wish for the disappearance of our troubles. We must not wish for the disappearance of our troubles, but rather the grace to transform them. I think it's really a nice bit of wisdom there. We must, and that's hard, I'll, yeah, in a week, when I'm at the pain of this surgery, it's hard not to wish for a disappearance of our trouble. But she's got the kernel of some great theology there, but rather wish for the grace to transform them. And if there's anything that the mystics, including the monks, the local monks here at the monastery in Merton, it's about a life of transformation. And there's something about your stance with challenges, trouble, you know, um, that you have to change your stance to the trouble that comes down the line, or maybe comes out of the sky. I'm thinking a lot of people caught in war zones, not just in the war zone between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, but all over the planet. Some we don't even hear about them. Most we don't hear about. They're not on the TV screens here, but they're there. I think of those people in that kind of situation. Haiti, my beloved Haiti, it's a war zone, some civil war zone. So to say, don't wish for the disappearance of your troubles, but wish and pray for the grace to help you transform them. That's an interesting quote by Simone Weil. Well, what is grace? I had that question asked to me by a young guy who's a good friend of mine now, but he was just sort of a hippie who used to come on Thursday nights, and he had two hippies for parents. A great guy, and he stayed after to ask, because I was talking about it. He said, "Well, what is grace?" Well, it's interesting. Traditions have different takes on it. I'll just give you two. The Zen tradition, and this came out of the San Diego Zen Center. Joko Beck's group. She's passed away, but there's still Ezra Beta. If you know Ezra Beta, he came out of that formation. And when they would put on their robes before they sat, they would chant. And one part of the chant is, we're putting on a formless field of benefaction. I always like that term, a formless field of benefaction. That's what they consider grace. It's formless. In other words, you can't pin down the form, but the benefaction, bene, is good. So a formless field of the energy for good. Okay, that's from the Zen tradition, and then from the more various Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions that believe in the same God. They're killing one another because they're the same God with a different name. But from that tradition, grace is a continuous overflowing of the divine life, of God, of Allah. Yeah, it's a kind of continuous overflowing of the life force from the divinity. I'm looking at the hanging over the altar here in the Zendo is in Aramaic, the first line of the Lord's Prayer. We're gonna work with the Beatitudes, but I spent almost a year on the 8 lines of the Lord's Prayer, and it was 8 practices, as it turns out, that got melded into one prayer that we say automatically. Our Mother, the way you just rattle it off. But the first line was Avun Devashmaya. Avun Devashmaya. We've heard the word Avun before, but Avun Devashmaya. And the way I rendered it, after about a month of chanting it and sitting with it and playing around on the page with it and listening to it, I translate that line as, "O beloved one," that's the Avun, "O beloved one, your oceanic womb births infinite blessing in waves of darkness and light." Yeah, yeah. "O beloved one, your oceanic womb births infinite blessing in waves of darkness and light." That it all started with this original blessing, and it hasn't stopped. But it's waves of darkness and light. It's all a blessing. And that's the thing to understand about grace, too. There's 2 faces for grace: darkness, dark grace, light grace. You could say fierce grace and friendly grace. It comes with a fierceness. The Fierce Grace is the title of Ram Dass's movie that they made about how he got paralyzed with a stroke and paralyzed and was in a wheelchair the rest of his life. It was called Fierce Grace because that led him to slow down totally and also find a new depth of the teaching. So grace can be fierce. The pandemic was fierce, but this came out of it. Dark, sure. I mean, but we don't often understand that. Um, so it comes in two forms. The Sufis understand it. If you know the Guest House, that's the perfect understanding of fierce grace and uh, friendly grace. And from that poem, really, that poem epitomizes uh, a concept that the Sufis snuck in from North Africa into France, and from France became, it came to be known as a blessing in disguise. Everything is a blessing. Sometimes it's obvious. That's the friendly kind of grace when something just happens at just the right time that opens a door, and it seems like just a remarkable bit of good luck. But that's the friendly grace. That's the waves of light. But then there's the waves of darkness. Okay, that the blessing is disguised. Now, a Sufi would tell you that when you get hit with dark grace, you have to go very deep. It's if you're on the surface, it'll stay dark and it will not appear like grace. So when you're hit with something, stricken with something, you have to go deep. You have to go from the mind to the heart, essentially. You have to go to your deepest thing that can resonate with it, and eventually you can see the grace. And I think we've all had that experience one time or another, at least, to where something was terrible, but then it led to something that we never could have gotten to. My best example for that is the two times our marriage fell apart here. It was fierce, and it was the worst times of my life. Really, those two times when Pam and I were split, even when I was not living in the house, dark, painful, for both of us. But here we are, both times. And first time we had serious, good counseling, and then uh, we both loved each other, but that's not enough sometimes. And then good counseling, and then the grace. I think it was just a lot of grace, a lot of grace. But it was fierce. But here we are. Yeah. And so you look at it different now once you go through it. And there was transformation. We don't have the kind of marriage we had in either of those two parts. So that's go back to Weil. You pray for the grace to transform the whole situation to something that's a different level, to evolve a marriage, evolve a relationship, to whatever. Yeah. So, uh, so to realize there are two kinds of grace. Now, the third thing would be what I call three keys to receiving grace. Grace is 24/7, 365. It's just here. Uh, there's three key things that help you receive it. And the first is failure, interestingly enough. Marriage failed a couple times. You lose something. If you know anything about the 12 steps, uh, the first the first step just basically says, I've tried and I can't do it on my own. And then you make a bit of, you just say, I need the higher power. And that really goes all the way through. The 11th step is about learning about meditation and whatever. We'll talk about that as after this, but all the way through, it's the question of my ego can't do it. You see, the ego mind is a resistance factor that was designed to get us out of childhood safely. Well, here it all worked. Here we are. But it remains a resistance factor. And this ego mind, I'll do it. We try to do it under our own power. And so we resist help. I should have had my knees done 10 years ago. Finally, the grace got through, and I'm doing it now. It'll help me through. But so failure is sometimes opens the door, and then humbleness, humility. It'll be the first beatitude. It's where Jesus started with in terms of the whole step by step of the spiritual journey. A bit of humbleness and humility, and you don't get humbled until you fail. Humbleness means your feet are on the ground. Humus, we'll talk about that next Saturday. And then the third thing would be just open heartedness. So failure, humbleness, and then finally, if somehow this operating system of the heart is where the grace, it resonates with the grace. It's always resonated with the grace, but if the heart's closed, says it's like having an umbrella. If you're in a perfect umbrella or an awning, you don't feel the rain. It can't get to you. Grace is like rain all the time, just coming down on us. The just and the unjust, the good and the bad, it doesn't matter. It's open to all of us. That's why you think in a really awful situation, somehow might get through. Might get through personally and then globally. When you start to experience grace and actually receive it. And the interesting thing about grace, receiving grace, and meditation, which is the fourth thing that's going to lead us to our silent meditation, it's not about trying harder. It's not like you're not trying enough. Maybe if I try harder, grace will come through, or I can transform you. The idea you can transform yourself is nonsense from any mystic point of view. The Sufis, Rumi's written poems about the idea. You think you're healing yourself? Laughter. No, you have to open yourself up. And so it's not about trying harder. It's about resisting less, dropping the resistance. Dropping the resistance is how things get through. The resistance is the ego mind. It's how it was designed. It needs to be sort of put in its place. It needs to, the ego mind needs to actually be transformed as well. Now, how do we do that? Well, I've been thinking about this all week as I've been thinking about grace, writing about grace, the way I do. That's how I prepare for one of these things. And at one point, this a poem came out. So this will take us actually to meditating. And it's called The Grace in Meditation. It's a short poem. Those are the best ones, I think. It goes like this. And it'll be in the Monday morning mail out. As we practice allowing ourselves to be drawn into contact and held graciously in the spirit in daily meditation. As we practice allowing ourselves, allowing is a key word there. It's not trying. We practice allowing ourselves to be drawn into contact and held graciously by the Spirit in daily meditation. Our sense of a fearful, isolated, tyrannical self ever so gradually dissolves into a humble servant of a life that loves. Yeah, there's a drawing here. Now, this is just deep mystic theology, but there's a sense that in the very center of us, there is this core of the divinity, or core of goodness, essential goodness, this benefaction that the Zen guys are talking about, a formless field of benefaction. In other words, it won't show up on a CAT scan. Okay, there's no form to it, but it's there, and that it has a magnetic kind of pull, and it's drawing us in. Why are you here? There's a lot of other things you could do that would be a lot easier or a little more entertaining, but here we are. So somehow we're drawn here. We're drawn into contact, okay, and held graciously, held in grace, but held graciously by the Spirit. Okay, this idea that meditation is going into a realm, descending into what I call the cave of the heart, and allowing yourself to be held, just held. Winnicott, one of the 20th century great psychologist, has the thing. He says nobody actually got held as a child in our kid life crisis. Nobody actually got held enough. Even if you had like a grandmother like I had, or two Buddhas for parents, none of us ever get the amount of holding that we need. And some of us, far from it, get very little holding at all. And just to be held like a mother holds a baby uh, to her breast, that feeling is what we're looking for, this feeling of being held. And in this case, being held by the creator of the universe, the force of, how, whatever you want to call it, the source, whatever. That's how you language it, could be different, but we're held by something that can actually hold us with unconditional love. Yeah. And so that's, the mystic is saying that's what we're all looking for. And if you can, when you show up, it's like this. This is a good image of meditation. You show up. The divine is there, the center is there, the essence is there, but we show up. Maybe that's why this has always been an image of prayer across different traditions, is putting the two together to make one. It's what not two really means. We're meant to be together with this power source. And then, all of a sudden you're planning what's going on tomorrow. So, and then you say, oh, yeah, when you bring yourself back, that's everybody's meditation, isn't it? The divine isn't going anywhere. The power, over here, we got a plug. Maybe don't plug in the plug. The plug's still there. Electricity's waiting. The power's waiting, but we don't plug in the plug. And so every time you bring your mind back into contact, you're there. And so that's actually the only thing you do once you descend and actually get into a realm where you feel like, okay, yeah, this is deeper than the superficial mind. Okay, down through the body, down to the heart. And then when you leave, this is the humbleness about meditation. Meditation will humble you. You just, doing this 50 years, and my mind still could go for the whole period and never even come back once. It happens. But then you bring it back. And then that's humility, okay? But gradually, here's the point. Gradually, something happens to the egoic self, which I sort of strong terms. It said, once our sense, our sense of fearful, isolated self, which I call the tyrannical self, seems like a tyrant giving you got to do this, it's top sergeant, but it is a kind of tyrant. Every so gradually, because you keep coming back to the real force in the universe, the time spent, every time you bring yourself back in a meditation, even if it's 50 times or 100 times, and you drift and you come back, every time you come back, it just gradually, over time, will turn that tyrannical self into a servant self. You don't have to get rid of your ego. It's still helpful. You do have to transcend it, and you do have to, in a way, transform it. It'll happen. I don't know how else you do it. If I had a simpler way than spending 50 years on the cushion, and it ain't done yet for me. The tyrant's still there, but his whip is a little shorter. Let's put it that way. And I know the game, and I can, but little by little, that self can actually be a servant of a life that loves, rather than a life that feels guilty or a life that feels like it never measures up. If you don't transform that, and I don't know, if you got a better idea, go for it. If you got a better route, go for it. But this idea of just bringing yourself in contact, even for 20 minutes, with this force that can transform anything. It transformed the intractable, Israel, Palestine. It can really, a climate thing. We everything we try to do for some of this stuff makes it worse sometimes. So we're trying to bring in some inside help, some vast help, and that's so this image of just staying present to be present in this moment is to live in a state of grace. And so every time you bring yourself back, even if it's only for a millisecond before you're off away again, which it is that way for me lots of times, even if it's only for a millisecond, something big is happening when you bring your mind back, you see, back down. So anyway, that's what I call a grace in meditation. So let's shift to that mode and actually practice that.